Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. Returning once again, your host with the moster, Dusty O'Connell, is me. And I am joined by our customary co-host, in-house analyst, columnist for Cold Omaha and 1500 ESPN in Minneapolis. Useful human and recent birthday haver, actually, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good. How are you?
You know, I'm all right. I'm older than you. That would make you what, 27, 28?
28.
28. Yes, excellent. Well, happy birthday.
I appreciate that.
The relentless march of time shall consume us all. So we have a preview of the Giants game coming up Monday night. Coming down the pike for you today. But before we get into that, I did want to take a moment and say thank you to our listeners, especially those who have felt like they should contribute to the Norse Code cause. This week we have two new sponsors on Patreon. Someone who goes by R, just the letter R, in lowercase, like Katie Lang, but with 5 fewer letters. And R contributes at the $3 a month level. So TYVM R. And John Seitz, I guess Seitz would be the German pronunciation, contributes at the $3.50 a month level, helping us keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. So, gentlemen or lady and gentlemen, as appropriate, thank you very much for your contribution. Your dollars contributed on a recurring basis will allow us to more accurately plan for the future of Norse Code, things like equipment upgrades, and primarily what most of your donations go to is just making sure that the lights stay on, that we can continue serving you episodes of the show through our fabulous content delivery network, and kind of enable us to create more digital multimedia content for you to consume in a timely way that is hopefully also enjoyable to you. So if you would like to become a contributing member of Norse Code, then you can make a one-time contribution at paypal.me/NorseCode, or you can do as R and John have done, go to patreon.com, make a recurring monthly contribution in any amount you would like. We suggest $3.50 a month. It seems to be a popular thing to do, and we've had 0 Loch Ness Monster attacks, or even incursions, since we instituted the $3.50 donation. So I guess help keep the streak alive, and continue to support the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. As I was going through and organizing the master donor list, so that in the event that we have tchotchkes or prizes to give away one day, we can hook up all of our donors first. I came across this note from Philip Bissell, who contributed a couple of weeks ago. Being a Vikings fan in Hawaii has been tough. It was even worse in the days before the internet. Can you imagine being like a Minnesota Vikings fan literally on an island thousands of miles away from any actual Vikings, with no internet, with maybe like a phone call every now and then with someone on the mainland to keep up? I imagine there's like television and all that, but still,
that's got to be brutal.
Literally can't imagine the difficulty and complexity of being a Minnesota Vikings fan in the land of the Rainbow Warriors.
I'm wondering, if the local newspapers probably have to carry NFL standings in them in a relatively easy to access location, because Hawaii is full of people with different NFL team. Hawaii doesn't have an NFL team, and so your sports coverage or your national whatever sports coverage has to be fairly comprehensive, right? I can imagine that if you're running a newspaper with a sports column, sure, you're covering the University of Hawaii, but you have to have some pretty good generic football coverage, right?
Well, I feel like it's either like relatively comprehensive, like they have, standings, or they had, I guess, standings broken down by division, or it was just like, here's the Pro Bowl. All right, see you next year, football.
Yeah, no, that's got to be brutal before the internet. Oh,
well, luckily,
I grew up in an age where the internet was not widely available, so you even more so.
Oh, that's true. I've said on the show, I believe the true like bright line between millennials and non-millennials is that millennials can't remember a time when there was no internet. And
so I was actually having this discussion with a games journalist friend of mine, and there's already a word for that. There's digital natives and non-digital natives. And they both can be millennials, according to sociologists. But I agree with you. I disagree. I think that that's a huge change. I think that there needs to be a distinction between people who grew up as the internet was growing up and grew up with the internet already established.
Exactly. If your parents were sending email and you were too young to figure out what it was, that, I don't know. At any rate, yes, as a digital non-native, I can vaguely conceive of this time when one could be a Vikings fan and live in Hawaii without the internet. But that requires I guess, a degree of dedication that I kind of struggled to wrap my head around. And Philip, I'm glad that we are here for you and that we don't have to live in that nightmare anymore. I imagine life in Hawaii is somehow even more pleasant when you get, the benefits of being on an island plus internet. So that's about all I got in terms of, listener support. Beyond, well, I guess, saving one last tip of the cap. I'm making the hat tip motion right now to all of our fans. Thank you very much for your support.
We very often have to narrate our actions on this podcast because it is not a video cast.
Exactly. With your continued support, you may see me making the hat tip motion one day, although I am not wearing a hat. Perhaps we can arrange for a hat to be procured, as well as a camera, so we can now with 100% more hat
Patreon.
tips.
Get
to Patreon. So I was trying to look up stuff about the Monday night curse or the primetime curse as it applies to the Vikings. I feel like this is a thing, right? Like it didn't like.
Oh, it certainly was a thing, and I remember I was talking to CC Norseman, who, and I think also Krauser at Krauserific. Both of them were very suspicious of the existence of this thing because it's like kind of ridiculous, and they were like, well, what if we? Because a lot of times the Vikings, when they had the primetime course, were also just a bad team. I've even argued on the podcast, like the curse is probably not real because remember the Vikings were also bad when they were losing games in primetime, and they looked it up, and one of them or both of them, and I'm sure Krauser, who listens to the podcast at least occasionally, will chime in and correct me, but they found one of them or both of them that. It's real. Like it's like the Vikings perform significantly, and I don't know like if it's statistically significant, but certainly it's statistically compelling to me personally. That the Vikings actually performed far worse in primetime games than they did in non-primetime games. We're trying to figure out why that is, like whether or not there's an actual psychological effect, whether it's the result of usually you play good teams and probably usually one of the two teams is good, and because the Vikings were bad, it was that team. So like that might be a reason, or it might just be a thing. It certainly doesn't seem to exist as like a random occurrence. I don't know. Again, sample sizes for Vikings primetime games after like they crapped out in the 2010 season is pretty small. But yeah, the primetime curse was real. But I think over the last couple of years, it's not. Certainly, the Vikings have already had a primetime game and they won it. So.
Well, and the strong implication there is that the Vikings are just no longer like a bad football team. Like the primetime curse seems like something that happened or that would have happened to the Vikings of old. Especially, given
it would have even happened to to good Vikings teams, 2009, to some extent 2008. Yeah. But certainly now that the team is no longer bad. You don't have to worry about the bad part, the 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013 version of the primetime curse.
Well, it's not even that we're not just like bad. It's just that like very like characteristically Vikings things that have continued to happen to this team, like week in and week out, have not been the kind of like death sentence that they would have been in other years. Like losing Adrian Peterson and Matt Khalil in the same game, like that. I mean, granted, we've talked about their, I guess, relative contributions to the team lately on the show, but you know, there was a time when having that happen would just be like, oh well, there goes the season. But we ended up going on to win that game and then the next one.
Yeah, no, it's pretty stunning. I mean, obviously it speaks to sort of the coaching difference, maybe the gulf is a better way to describe it, between Mike Zimmer and Leslie Frazier and/or Brad Childress. Certainly that plays a role. Some of it is just the team has depth and is talented. That plays a role. I mean, there's a lot of things that play a role. It's very difficult to just like figure out every factor behind it. But yeah. You're right. I think like things that have typically happened to the Vikings certainly are happening to the Vikings now, but they're not insurmountable obstacles in the way that they were.
The defense can just carry the team a little further. So let's talk a little bit about that coaching gulf. Fran Tarkenton this week, publicly lauded Mike Zimmer for taking over the Vikings. Said it was one of the best things to happen to the organization, probably ever. And Sam Monson, Norse Code guest and football writer, had a great piece about how Minnesota has been using, I guess, confusing coverages to its advantage, and mixing up assignments, showing basically Munson shows how the Vikings have been using very similar defensive looks, but having personnel assigned very differently within those looks. And the net effect has been to confuse opposing offenses and allow the Vikings, more opportunities for sweet sacks and interceptions.
Yeah, no, it's a really good piece. A lot of the stuff that he's talking about, initially I was kind of surprised about the piece because I was reading it and it starts off with, the Vikings coverage concepts are relatively simple, and then everything else is really confusing. And I read the simple part first, and I was like, well, that's not really how a lot of people kind of describe, the Vikings defense. Simple is not like a word that people typically use.
Well, the defense itself isn't simple, but it could look as though it was, the same from play to play, when the reality is rather the opposite, I guess.
Right. Well, so there's a couple of things that he talks about. He talks about how the defense is comfortable with a bunch of different coverages. There's cover 1, cover 3, cover 2, cover 4, cover 6, which, by the way, that's actually just a combination of cover 2, cover 4. It's not like there's 6 safeties up top or anything like that. But there's a bunch of different coverage shells. There's a bunch of different coverage types. There's man coverage, zone coverage, there's matchup coverage, and there's different rules inside matchup coverage. You pick up this player, you pick up this player, that sort of stuff. And so, the Vikings, they don't like roll coverage after the snap or do anything like that. They'll show one thing pre-snap, and that's pretty much sort of what they'll do, post-snap. They don't really, confuse teams that way, but they're still extremely difficult to scout because they'll have so many different coverages that, your set of route packages, like against a cover 3 team like Seattle or Atlanta, your route packages can be pretty well designed because they're going to run cover 3 every single play, or cover 1 on plays that they want to mix it up. And so you can create route packages that attack cover 3 specifically. But here you have to have a multitude of routes and route packages set so that you can attack different types of coverages. And maybe you're going to be wrong about that because, hey, it's a cover 2 shell, but it's actually not zone, it's man or something like that. But up front, there's a lot of disguise. So, they'll talk about this piece, and I encourage people to read it. This piece talks about how it's difficult to tell, if the Vikings are in man or if they're in a particular type of zone, or even, sometimes, if they've got a single high safety, you can't tell if they're in cover 1 or cover 3 because of what they do up front. They put 8 players, occasionally 9 players up on the line of scrimmage, and you can't tell who's going to rush, and that's been a really significant part of the Vikings defense. And maybe a team's going to crack the code, and it's going to be difficult for the Vikings defense to do stuff. But typically this is not. This is a wrinkle. It's not a reliance. And he talks about how it's difficult to call protection. It's different for offensive linemen to do stuff. And you've got such an athletic defense on the back end. Especially those linebackers like Kendricks and Barr, that you have the ability to rush whoever you want and drop whoever you want in coverage, and they're not going to be out of their landmark by the time they need to be there in order to play effective coverage. And so. Because they can just move around the field at will. And so you can rush 4, but they won't know which 4, and so you'll have 2 unblocked defenders and stuff like that. Really good piece. Definitely encourage it. It talks a lot about the way to design rushes, the way to integrate coverages with rushes and stuff like that. We'll link it in the show notes, of course. But yeah, it's a nice read.
Well, and so some of that has to function out of the ability of the coaches to, effectively rotate through all their different actual coverages, even though they all look the same, without giving teams, an opportunity to, I guess, get ahead of the game in terms of being able to predict the coverages that, coaching is going to play. Do you think that there is an opportunity for other teams to kind of figure out the rotation schedule or the strategy for picking cover 1 versus cover 3 or cover 6 on a given series, or do you think that it's going to remain a mystery even as we get close to week 17?
I think it will be a mystery. I think that in part because, and I was talking to a couple of players about this, Zimmer mixes up the rotation, changes the rules for which the Vikings players have to follow and determine their coverage assignments about every month, so about every 4 games. And so if you begin to sense a pattern, that's actually probably more of an issue than it is a solution. Like, you may have detected the wrong pattern. And then also, Anthony Barr, and to some extent Harrison Smith, will also modify the play based off of the personnel that are on the field as well as down on distance. So, the game planning will allow you to determine sort of what you want to call when you're in a certain down and distance. Like, hey, they've got, they're on 11 personnel. It's 3rd and 10. There's a good chance that they're going to run the 4 verts concept like they used to. Like, let's take Carolina, for example. They run 4 verts on 3rd and long a lot, especially in 11 personnel. Then we don't want to be in cover 3. We want to either be in cover 1 or cover 2 or cover 4. And so we're going to call cover 4 on this play. And then you go out there, and the 3 players are bunched instead of spread out. The 3 receivers are bunched instead of spread out. And so you're like, oh, well, they're not going to run 4 verticals. We cannot be in zones. We're going to check out of cover 4 and into cover 1. And so it's, or not cover 1, but, cover 2 with a box zone, whatever, right? And so, the Vikings have been adaptable enough to the thing that they're looking at in front of them, that I think it's not easy to figure out sort of if there's a pattern or a rotation, going forward into the season.
So it's really just an element of what is going to be most effective at screwing over the offense and having players who can, execute on kind of defensive audibles like that.
Yeah, and it's really tough. Like, we know that the defense is complex and it's difficult to learn, and that's really important and needs to be emphasized. But another thing is, you cannot organize this defense without versatile athletes too. So if you don't have a cornerback who can play both man and zone coverage, if you don't have a linebacker that has the ability to rush the passer, play man coverage against running backs and tight ends, and zone against crossing route receivers, then the scheme is not going to work. And they happen to have all of these versatile players. So, the defense dials up whatever's going to work against that specific offense, which makes them difficult to scout. And they have the ability to execute that thing that they just dialed up, which makes them difficult to... It makes it difficult to defend against the defense, I guess. You understand what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, and of course it doesn't hurt when you have perhaps the best safety in the league who is an equivalent threat either at the line of scrimmage, on the pass rush, or in the backfield, or even in the middle against a slot receiver.
Right. Now that Harrison Smith has improved pretty drastically as a man coverage player, he is a complete safety. I still can't get over that Troy Polamalu comparison that Brett Coleman over at Battle Red Blog, or Battle Red Blog, the Houston Texans SB Nation site. That comparison to Harrison Smith that he made, to Troy Polamalu that he made, because it is really perfect, because sometimes Harrison Smith looks like or is freelancing and it works. Sometimes, he's playing man coverage. Sometimes he's a deep safety. Sometimes he's a box safety. Sometimes he's a pass rusher. Sometimes he's the primary run defender and acts like the will linebacker. Does a ton of stuff, and he does it all really well.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the New York Giants, given that we are, playing them on Monday night and all. So, given all the stuff we said about the Vikings defense and its very, I guess, dynamic nature, even though it may not seem so when you're just looking at 8 guys lined up on the line, it's the sort of thing that is difficult for an offense to prepare for and, I guess, defend against. Is that weird to say? But the Giants, Mike Wabshall has an article on Vikings.com that will also be linked in the show notes, and I'm quoting from it now. The Giants used their no-huddle offense on 44 snaps last week against Washington, according to NFL.com's gamebook play-by-play, and it was extremely effective early in the game, as Manning operated from the no-huddle on 10 of the first 14 snaps. The rhythm the Giants generated resulted in Manning going 6 of 8 for 69 yards and a touchdown, averaging 7.6 yards per play in that span. That seems like a good way to gather first downs by running an extremely effective no-huddle offense. And that seems
7.6 yards per play. That's not bad.
That's not the worst. So that seems like a potential thorn in the side of the Vikings. Do you think that we'll be able to adjust to a no-huddle offense? Are we going to, try to employ tactics to slow down the roll of the offense? Because I think, New York's strategy is going to be very similar to what it was in Week 3. Just come out and run the offense really quickly, try to keep the defense on its heels as best as one can, and try to score right away and play from a lead.
It's interesting because you take a look at some of the statistics that help you figure out whether or not an offense can continue to be effective, whether or not it isn't. And one of the things that has been sort of a talking point for the Vikings has been how the offensive points that they've put up is not commensurate with the offensive statistics they've gathered, and that those points that they've put up might actually start falling. It might hurt the team. It's kind of the other way for the New York Giants, where they haven't put up a ton of points. I think so. In their last couple of games, it's been 20 points, 16 points, 27 points. And sort of the watermark you want to hit, I think, is probably around 28 points. They haven't hit that yet. But offensively, they've got all the markers of, a pretty good offense. They rank 6th in total yards per play, like you said. When there are no huddle against Washington, they had 7.6 yards per play. That's absurd. That by itself would rank first in the NFL by quite a margin, just to put that in context.
Well, that was only on the first series. They dialed it back. They were not nearly as successful in the rest of the game. Okay. But that first series where they scored a touchdown, they were lethally efficient.
Yeah, and that makes sense then. They've got a decent rushing attack, not an amazing one or anything like that, but they tend to generate, first downs at a pretty decent rate. The thing that sticks out is that I think they're second in the league in percentage of drives. Yeah, second in the league in percentage of drives that end in a turnover, despite the fact that Eli Manning has somehow managed to not be super Eli Manning. He's only thrown 3 interceptions and therefore has an interception rate of only 2.8%, which is below average. And I mean, it's still higher, or not below average. It's still higher than the NFL current average, which is 2.4. But I think over the course of the season, it might be closer to average. But it's still not. It ranks 15th in the league in terms of interception rate. So it's still not that many interceptions, especially relative to Eli Manning, who I believe has now twice or 3 times led the league in interceptions. And it's really been about fumbles. They've had 7 fumbles, which is tied for 3rd in the league, and those fumbles have been particularly bad. They've just happened at bad spots, and so the points that they've put up are less than the points that they probably should be putting up. Some of those interceptions or some of those fumbles are probably not going to be continuing. Maybe it doesn't happen against the Vikings. Maybe the Vikings generate more turnovers. But that's the biggest issue with their offense. It's not about their ability to move the ball downfield. Just in general, they've been able to do that. And I imagine that the no huddle hurry up stuff that Wapshall's been talking about, that stuff serves to help simplify defensive look, especially against Washington, a team that tries to engage in some complex defensive play and try to trick opposing teams, even though they've got a pretty standard setup in terms of what their cornerbacks do and what their safeties do. If you engage in no huddle, you have the ability to simplify the defense. In terms of a response, obviously the Vikings are going to have to continue to generate turnovers. I think that you can't hide Eli for too long. Like, maybe once Eli enters the playoffs, you can count on maybe 4 games where he doesn't throw too many picks, and that's how he makes Super Bowls. But for the most part, you can't rely on a 4-game stretch of a below average interception Eli. And I think that there's going to be a bunch of interception opportunities, especially with the way the defense is designed. They haven't been up against a bunch of stellar defenses yet. New Orleans and Dallas and Washington. And so, there's this possibility that, their high efficiency overall, it masks some stuff. Their high turnover rate is more representative of who they are and stuff like that. I wouldn't be surprised if they continue this no huddle stuff. I mean, they've got a great offensive coordinator. Well, he's the head coach now. But Ben McAdoo is great at designing offenses and stuff like that. They've got some pretty deadly players like Sterling Shepard and, of course, Odell Beckham. Their offensive line is playing a lot better, which we'll talk about just in a second. And so they've got a bunch of pieces that are working for them. They've got a bunch of things that indicate that they should be scoring more points than they do. But they're a team that tends to make mistakes on offense, and so that's kind of where the Vikings will need to pounce.
And historically, they have. We have a New York Post article in the show notes, quoting from that. Manning has started 7 times against the Vikings and never, ever has played a great game. Only once in 2013 has Manning been able to throw more touchdown passes than interceptions. Of the 14 picks in the 7 games, 5 of them have been brought back for touchdowns. So when facing the Vikings, Manning has coughed up as many touchdown returns as he has thrown touchdown passes. Giants are 2-5 in his 7 games against the Vikings, and his passer rating is a dismal 54.76. So there may be... Victor Cruz is quoted in the article as saying... paraphrased as saying that maybe Eli Manning just doesn't like the color purple. And that is...
Well, it's not a good week for that.
There will be much purple this week. Cruz in the Giants interviewed for this story, all kind of have like a laugh with it or whatever, Eli Manning is, one of the reporters ask Eli if he thinks that the Vikings have his number. And Eli's, well, gosh, I don't really think any of the Vikings have my phone number. Maybe Linval Joseph, which is actually probably true. If anyone's going to have Eli's number this week, it's probably going to be Linval. But a lot of joking around, with the press or whatever. But Victor Cruz maybe lets it slip a little bit when he's quoted as saying, statistically. And he's talking about their, performance against the Vikings, and I'm doing air quotes now for all those who are not seeing the video feed. Statistically, it is what it is, which sounds like the attitude of someone who knows that history is against them when playing this particular team.
I find like Eli Manning splits against the Vikings pretty fascinating, actually, because. I mean, he's not supposed to be that bad of a quarterback. Some people think he's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. I definitely disagree with that. He's a high variance quarterback whose lows happen to all be against the Vikings. One of his worst games was probably, that Josh Freeman game that both teams were trying to lose, and one team evidently failed.
That was one of the worst games in just in just football. Period. The Thursday Night Miracle.
Yeah, every time football Twitter complains about the game that they're watching on primetime, I have to remind them of the Freeman Manning game.
It's like you didn't see Josh Freeman come out and lose his football spirit. He literally left it all out on the field that night.
It was true. He left his very identity as a football player out on the field.
his very soul was stolen from him that night at the Meadowlands.
Exactly.
So we can look forward to, a Vikings defense that will, probably thoroughly dominate the Giants again. I mean, we're accustomed to a New York defense that allows the Vikings to hang 40 points on them, pretty consistently, and that certainly has not been the way of our offense this year.
Actually, hold on, Dusty. Let's edit this part out. I moved the offensive line piece just up to because there's something about their offensive line that I want to discuss. So we'll talk about their offensive line real quick before we move on to their defensive line.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then.
So I just put that in the wrong spot, and I just moved it back to the right spot.
I was going through the show notes, and I was like, wait a minute, I think I'm going to get stuck talking about their defense, and we really want to talk about their O-line.
Yeah, so we'll do that.
Okay. So we're accustomed to seeing a Vikings offense that can, hang 40 points on the New York defense. But before we, explore that much further, let's talk specifically about the Giants' offensive line, which, Eli Manning can tell us that they have maybe not come through for him in the clutch in the past, but they're, improved this year somewhat.
There's a really good piece at Big Blue View that takes a look at the Giants' offensive line. I remember having not so great thoughts about them going into the season. I remember, watching an occasional preseason game with them going into the season, and this piece is basically like, look, everyone was worried about this offensive line, and honestly, this offensive line has been performing a lot better than I think a lot of people expected. And that one, that statement took me by surprise. So, obviously, I had to watch a little bit of their offensive line. I also made sure to take a look at sort of what independent, scouting organizations or grading organizations like Pro Football Focus had to say about it. And so in the piece, the guy talks about sort of on film, this is what, these players look like. Obviously, we'll link that piece so you get kind of a better understanding. One player that I've always been high on for the Giants, Weston Richburg is playing as well as ever. But players that have typically not played all that well: left tackle Eric Flowers, right guard John Jerry, right tackle Bobby Hart. Maybe not played all that well is not an accurate representation of Bobby Hart because he hasn't played too much. But he was a 7th round pick. He's replacing Marshall Newhouse. And then also a player, Justin Pugh, who is selected in the draft to be a tackle, but is playing guard. They're all playing a lot better than a lot of people expected, especially Eric Flowers. So I took a look at what the PFF player grades were. Eric Flowers, who was the worst, even worse than TJ Clemmings, was the worst tackle according to PFF last year, is now ranked 7th overall for them. So he's playing spectacularly well. Bobby Hart on the right side is ranked 28th overall, and this includes left and right tackles. So if you're ranked 28th and you're a right tackle, you're probably better than most right tackles because teams tend to put their worst tackle on the right side because they're old. If you take a look at the guards, Justin Pugh right now is their top-ranked guard. John Jerry is their 10th-ranked guard. You take a look at centers, which I didn't actually take that much of a look at because I just understand Weston Richburg to be very good. You take a look at centers. Weston Richburg's not playing as well as he has in the past. He's ranked 30th out of 30-some centers, but I have every confidence that he'll play up to sort of what he was last year, at least in the long run. Maybe commensurate with the Giants' offensive line improvements. The center has not improved as much. Either way, even if this is sort of the true Weston Richburg, that he's not playing all that well, you've got 4 players who are wildly exceeding expectations, playing well above the positional averages for them, and will present some problems. Caveat, of course, is that against the Dallas defensive line, it's kind of the opposite of the Dallas offensive line. Against the Dallas defensive line, you're probably going to look pretty good, especially because half of it is suspended. Against the New Orleans Saints pass rush, you're probably going to look pretty good, even though Cam Jordan is there. just because they haven't been able to organize a defense that either can create pressure quickly enough so that before the ball comes out, or just in general have the ability to beat offensive linemen. But Washington has an underrated, very good pass rush. They've got a great nose tackle in Chris Baker. They've got Ryan Kerrigan. They've got Preston Smith, who you'll recall at the very last game at the end of last year beat out Danielle Hunter for having the most sacks for a rookie. You've got all those players, right? And I think if you have the ability to stop those players somewhat consistently, then you've probably got the makings of a pretty good offensive line. Not to mention that good offensive lines get these kinds of scores against bad defensive lines. So that's something to pay attention to. Obviously, the Vikings defensive line is a huge sort of calling card, right? It's a huge part of how the Vikings have been winning over the past couple of games. Obviously, Harrison Smith is there, and you've got those linebackers, and you've got, cornerbacks that you may or may not trust, like Terrence Newman, Xavier Rhodes, Trey Waynes, Captain Munnerlyn. But sort of the driver of how the Vikings have been playing is that defensive line, and so seeing this matchup is going to be really interesting. If Weston Richburg is genuinely not playing that well, then there's obviously a lot of opportunity for Linval Joseph to do a lot of big things and make big plays. But if the left guard and the right guard are playing well, it'll be interesting to see if Tom Johnson continues to get pressure. I don't know if Sharif Floyd is healthy yet. I think he's not because he didn't practice on Wednesday, and as far as I can tell, he didn't practice when we're recording today. But if he's healthy enough for the game, it'll be interesting to see if he can make waves against them. Tom Johnson is getting more pressure against teams than all but 6 defensive tackles right now in the NFL, and of course that's a little skewed because he's a backup pass rushing specialist defensive tackle, so he's just going to get more. But still, there's no backup tackle that ranks higher than him. Everybody above him is a starter, players like Aaron Donald. And so it'll be interesting to see how he does against these guards that are doing really well. Shamar Stephen, of course, is more of a run blocker, and seeing how Linval Joseph and Shamar Stephen do in terms of run defense against a team that's doing a pretty good job opening up a running lane. Not an amazing job. They only have something like 3.8 yards a carry or something like that, which, honestly, I think Vikings fans would kill for right now. But it's going to be interesting to see if they can open up holes against what you said was the 7th ranked run defense. But definitely a much, much improved offensive line over last year. In terms of what they've been able to put together, both on film and sort of statistically, it's that I think is kind of an underrated matchup, and it's going to define a lot of things in terms of how effective the Vikings are going to be.
Well, but looking at the Carolina game, they're not the best offensive line in the league, but they're far from the worst. And Carolina ran, I think it was 33 or 34 plays out of a no-huddle offense, probably to try and do the same thing that the Giants are going to do this week. And, we hung, 5 sacks from 5 different... 8 sacks from 6 different defensive players, if I remember correctly. Smith, Robeson, Joseph, Griffin, and did Captain get one? Oh, yeah, Barr.
And
So
yeah.
Given that, do you really think that the Giants are going to be able to deflect the kind of overwhelming edge pressure that the Vikings have brought in every game this season?
I do not think that the Vikings will be blanked out on the sack stat sheet. I think that they're definitely going to get at least 1 sack, probably at least 2 sacks. I think they had 5 against Aaron Rodgers, 8 against Cam Newton. I don't even remember the first game, but he was Marcus Mariota, so I don't really care. I don't know. I think that the Carolina Panthers offensive line has been somewhat overrated, but then again, in the past several games, they've had to go up against the Vikings defense and the Broncos defense twice, and I think that the way the offensive line played last season was overshadowed by how they played in the Super Bowl, and then against teams like Denver and Minnesota. So I don't know how good the Carolina offensive line is relative to how good the Giants offensive line is playing right now. So I can't tell you, but I think that 8 sacks against any offensive line is really telling in general, and I think that the Vikings are definitely uniquely talented along the defensive line, and so I think they'll get hits and get pressure and get sacks. I think the question is whether or not they'll get enough pressures and enough sacks to overcome some of the weaknesses that they probably have in terms of matching up against them when it comes to skill position players, especially that pretty deadly receiver core.
Well, yeah, and that you briefly mentioned the three-headed hydra of Victor Cruz, OBJ, and Sterling Shepard. None of the three were on the field with Manning last year for the 49-17 dismantling. The chances that we are able to, repeat on that, given the strength of their receiver core. I mean, how much time is Eli going to have to throw the ball really, and how is he not going to throw like 3 picks?
Well, I think I wouldn't be surprised if, especially with Ben McAdoo having sort of his West Coast roots, I think that they're going to be pretty comfortable moving to a very short game in order to alleviate pressure. So like 3-step, 5-step drops, a lot of shotgun, stuff like that, and allowing because all three of these players are really good at after catch work, at the short game and stuff like that. Odell Beckham, Sterling Shepard, Victor Cruz, and to some extent Shane Vereen. They're all very good at catching the ball on a short target and turning into a big gain. More Shepard and Beckham than Cruz, who's kind of a deep threat from the slot. But yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see sort of what the Vikings offense, or what the Giants' offensive response to the Vikings ability to put pressure on is. But the Giants themselves are pretty comfortable with the idea of passing short. Eli Manning, for example, has had I think this year a relatively, especially relative to him, a relatively shorter passing depth. So his average depth of target is 8.2, which is one of the reasons his completion rate is so high at 71%. Admittedly, he's had, I think, a lower drop rate than any other team in the league, any other quarterbacks have to deal with in the league, so that plays a role too. But yeah, I think that they're gonna run these 7-yard routes and these 12-yard routes like the sticks. And find ways to exploit the cushion that the Vikings, cornerbacks might be able to give them, especially, with a speed demon like Odell Beckham, at using his agility to get open in space, and so that creates problems for both Xavier Rhodes and Trey Waynes. He has the ability to just use his speed to get open deep, and that creates problems for Terrence Newman, and to some extent Captain Munnerlyn. He's a much stronger player than I think a lot of people anticipate, and that creates a big problem for Captain Munnerlyn if Odell Beckham is ever lined up in the slot. Sterling Shepard is a phenomenal route runner. Sterling Shepard's an excellent receiver. I don't want to compare him to Stephon Diggs, which means I would be comparing him to Antonio Brown because Stephon Diggs is Antonio Brown. But he is sort of in the same mold in that you'd kind of conceive of him to be a slot receiver, but he's actually fairly excellent, on the outside. He does a very good job of winning on the outside. He does a very good job of shielding the ball, making sure he doesn't get pushed at the sideline, making sure that he has exclusive access to the ball and stuff like that. And so he has the ability to win in a bunch of different ways, but for the most part, he is an excellent route runner with a lot of agility. In that sense, he matches up very well for him against Xavier Rhodes and Trey Waynes, who especially Waynes, they have trouble with receivers who break inside in terms of routes or run pivot routes to the outside and stuff like that. And so in terms of a matchup, he's going to be pretty difficult to deal with. And just in general, both Odell Beckham and Sterling Shepard do a very good job of breaking tackles and winning after the catch. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings decided that, hey, they're probably going to go to a short passing game. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll our cornerbacks up in press coverage, give up, the potential for a deep ball, which, with the recovery ability of both Rhodes and Waynes, makes it, possible, unlikely that they have the ability to recover. Maybe not Newman so much, but give up the possibility for a deep ball if you lose in press coverage. Because the deep ball is going to take time for it to, in order for it to be fired essentially from the quarterback, and that'll allow the defensive line to get there in time, because the defensive line won't be able to get there in time if you continually allow these short routes to get underneath the coverages, and then they generate some yards after the catch. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was the game plan against these receivers, who otherwise match up really, really well against the Vikings cornerbacks.
Okay, so let's maybe flip it around, look at the Giants defense a little bit, unless there's any other particular notes you wanted to make about the Giants offensively.
No, I think we've basically got it covered in terms of the Giants offense.
Okay, so let's take a look at the Giants defensive line. That was I guess a package slated for upgrades in the offseason. Giants used the franchise tag on Jason Pierre-Paul, Olivier Vernon. So the idea, well, Damon Harrison. The idea being, upgrade the defensive line. However, despite lots of pressures, Jason Pierre-Paul is third or fourth at his position in quarterback pressures so far this season. They've only third highest total in the league with 6 pressures. Despite that, only 4 sacks from the Giants' defensive line. Where is this? Where's all the money they spent on this upgrade going?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It depends on sort of who you ask in terms of pressure. So, for example, if you take a look at Pro Football Focus numbers, Jason Pierre-Paul has 14 pressures and ranks tied for 8th or something like that. Which that's not bad either. It's not as if what a slacker. And that's compared to all defensive linemen. So that includes interior linemen like Leonard Williams and Geno Atkins and Aaron Donald, who are all beating him in terms of pressure rate. I think it's a fair question, in terms of how much pressure they've been generating in general. I did some numbers running what PFF has in terms of pressure rates to compare defensive lines. Side note, Minnesota ranks 3rd in overall pressure rate and obviously 1st in sack rate. So there's that. The New York Giants overall only rank 14th in total pressure rate. So Pierre-Paul might be due for upward regression, where his pressures will probably turn into more sacks. Like this article that we're going to link in the show notes says, again, from Big Blue View, pressures tend to predict future sacks better than anything else. Even if some individual players that's not quite true for Brian Robinson, for example, that's not really been true. I think at some point Jason Pierre-Paul is going to convert those pressures into sacks. But in general, the Giants, who have, I think, total 4 sacks for the season, the Giants are not converting pressure into sacks at a rate that's commensurate with who they are. But they're also not getting, enormous amounts of pressure. They're just getting more pressure than the amount of sacks that they've been getting would imply. So we're probably going to see some upward regression in terms of pressure to sacks. I wouldn't be surprised, especially against this offensive line, if there's 2 or 3 sacks as a result of it, and the Giants could almost double potentially their sack total for the season in one game. But it's not something I would identify as an area of enormous concern. But I will say that it's underrated. It's a pretty good article that talks about those pressure rates and how the pressure rates are not giving us a good understanding of sort of who they are as a team. Olivier Vernon's been playing pretty well. And then Damon Harrison, Jonathan Hankins up front have been doing a very good job stopping the run. Like you said, something like 7th in run defense. So the defensive line is, in general, doing their job, except at the very end of the pressure part of the equation of turning a pressure or a hit into a sack. I think that's probably going to come back, but I think it's not going to come back so much that you classify it from a not worry into a worry instead of a not worry into this is an average thing you must deal with.
Well, that's all well and good. However, the Giants performed pretty decently line-wise against Dallas, who is widely regarded to have one of the best offensive lines in the league. And
that's true. The defensive line did a fantastic job against the Dallas offensive line.
To be charitable, Minnesota does not have that.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting because I think that if you take a look at some of the box score stats for the Giants, you'd be like, well, they're a pretty decent defense. But I think that if you take a look at some of these other statistics, they're actually a pretty poor defense. They're tied for having the 4th worst in terms of scoring rate. They're the only defense that doesn't have any turnovers, if I'm reading this correctly, which it's got to be a problem. And so to some extent, they're not doing things that even if they're not allowing a ton of points, they're also not creating a ton of points. I think they're league average in terms, for example, of points per drive. But like they rank fourth. I think nearly half of all drives end in a score against them. So there are some problems there. But I think that you're right that the nature of the Vikings offensive line kind of nullifies a lot of that, especially when it comes to the run game, and especially, how the Giants are particularly adept at stopping the run. With the way that the offensive line is constructed, they're probably not going to get a lot of push up front against a Giants defensive line that has done such a good job defending against the run. I do think that, and it depends on sort of how much help they have and stuff like that. I do think that they'll find some ways to protect the passer. They'll find some ways to sort of nullify the pass rush and stuff like that. But I think that will jump up. And I think that your point that they've been doing a pretty good job against some pretty good offensive lines is pretty smart, because I think that that's the exact opposite of what the Vikings have.
Looking at this article that, of course, will be in the show notes from Big Blue View. Sam Bradford has only played in 2 games, but he's already been sacked 6 times for a sack rate of 9.2%. That is currently the 3rd highest in the league and well above his career norm. Further down during the offseason, the Vikings made a move they thought would shore up the right side of the line, because we all know Matt Khalil and TJ Clemmings are maybe not Pro Bowl contenders. Stuff that would shore up the right side of the line is they gave TJ Clemmings more time to learn and develop on the bench by signing Andre Smith. So far, Smith has not been good.
That's pretty generous. He appreciates the compliment.
A remarkably fair and even-handed assessment of play that has, in fact, not been good. But yeah, so potential softness defending against edge rushers, and you mentioned in particular run defense. Are we going to see another situation where Jerick McKinnon gets 15 carries and Matt Asiata gets some goal line work, assuming we get there?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was actually kind of telling that Jerick McKinnon got the run in the 2-point attempt, the 2-point conversion, and that he converted it, which I think that gives the Vikings a lot of confidence in his ability to be an every down back going forward. But I do think that they're going to give Matt Asiata more snaps as a goal line back and more snaps as a 3rd down back until McKinnon can prove that he can be consistent in pass protection. I know that a lot of people saw that sack that he gave up, or maybe Alex Boone gave it up. It kind of depends on who you ask. But certainly Jerick McKinnon was 1-on-1 against Thomas Davis and lost. But he was also really good in pass protection on the edge, I think against an edge rusher, actually, of all people. And held up that player well on a snap a few drives later. And so we'll see sort of how that progresses for him. But right now, Matt Asiata is very clearly the most reliable pass protector that they have. So on 3rd and long, they might have Asiata in there. They might potentially switch him up with Jerick McKinnon, depending on how they want to do things. But I think that we're going to see a bunch of Matt Asiata at the goal line. Beyond that, it's it's going to be interesting to see how that goes in general. McKinnon is probably a better creator, whereas Asiata does a better job taking advantage of the opportunities that are in front of him. And I think with this offensive line, you want a creator. You want someone who runs, maybe more like sort of a more reckless player does. I mean, I guess the quintessential Hall of Fame example is Barry Sanders. But, obviously, Jerick McKinnon's not Barry Sanders. But stylistically, you want a player that's more likely to create than one that relies on sort of what's happening in front of him. Stylistically, Hall of Famer Emmitt Smith, right? And so it's going to be difficult for the Vikings to generate those yards on the ground against this defensive line. But I think that with McKinnon in there, I think that you've got more of an opportunity to generate those successful runs and to do stuff with the blocking that is available. I think that this Big Blue View article on the at the end, when it talks about the Vikings offensive line, is definitely generous. Calling it not one of the worst offensive lines in the league is for certain generous. He says that Minnesota's allowed pressure on 14% of pass plays, which ranks 19th through 3 games. He's using Football Outsiders numbers as charting project, which is nice, but I have got a lot of disagreement with the way that they've been charting pressures. I've been looking over the past couple of weeks the way they've been charting pressures, and I really, honestly, definitely disagree with them. They have been much worse at allowing pressures. They've been one of the worst in the league in allowing pressure. And I think anybody who watches the offensive line play, and obviously your eyes will deceive you, but anyone who's watched the Vikings offensive line play will agree that it's actually one of the worst in the league. And so that's going to be certainly a significant problem for the Vikings. TJ Clemmings is going to be playing at left tackle. I think that his game was overrated by a lot of people because, what was the phrase? His name wasn't called, which I understand. Like, that's a pretty decent benchmark for an offensive lineman if you don't hear their name. But, sometimes it's just the announcer doesn't say their name, and they should have. Clemmings struggled a lot in that game, both in pass protection and as a run blocker. A lot of people talk about how his pass protection was genuinely good. It wasn't. It wasn't even average. It was definitely below average. And so I'm pretty worried about that from that perspective. And I think the Vikings offensive line is going to give up a lot of pressure. I don't know how much of that's going to turn into sacks. I think that Bradford's been doing a pretty decent job of preventing pressure from turning into sacks. But for sure, it's a worry.
The Giants have pretty favorable matchups on offense. They have favorable matchups downfield. On defense, they have pretty favorable matchups at the line. I guess probably downfield as well against everyone except for Stephon Diggs, who is Antonio Brown, as we've discussed. And even though Jerick McKinnon is Emmitt Smith, there are a lot of opportunities for those classic Vikings like 2.2 yard runs. So, I mean, are we really just relying on our defense to bail us out again and score 2 touchdowns? Are we reliant on the pick six to win this game, or what is the Vikings' clear path to victory?
I think that the matchup is a problem in terms of offensively and defensively, those receivers against those cornerbacks. The fact that the offensive line is performing a lot better for the Giants than I would have anticipated. Those matchups are a problem, but the Vikings are just inherently a more talented team. So it's like not. Stylistically, there's a lot of problems in terms of the matchups. Obviously, the offensive line worries me a lot against that Giants defensive line, who are probably better than their sack numbers give them credit for. But, I mean, the Giants, like they have been for the past couple of years, are very weak at linebacker. I think that their secondary is weak. I think that, for example, Landon Collins is a little bit overrated as a safety. I think that, just in general, those cornerbacks are weak. So even if, they've got good matchups in terms of stylistic stuff, I think that on offense, the Vikings do have ways to win. They've got more talented receivers and tight ends to match up against those guys in the secondary and in the back seven. I think that Jerick McKinnon is just generally just a really good running back that would be difficult to cover as a pass catcher. Will be difficult to chase down as a runner. I think on the other side of the ball, the Vikings defensive line is still going to just do stuff. I think that Harrison Smith is just going to do stuff. I think that Anthony Barr is going to show up. I think that Linval Joseph is going to make hay. And so I think that the matchups are a problem, and I think that the matchups will dictate that the Giants play better against the Vikings than they would in equivalently talented team that had different skill sets. But I don't think that means that the Giants are going to win or anything like that. I just think there's a lot of points of concern in areas where the Giants stylistically have an advantage, whereas against other defenses that are similarly talented, fictional defenses, because obviously this is the best defense. But against other defenses that would be technically, as talented but have a different skill set, the Giants would have a lot more problems. So I don't want to overstate these matchup problems. They exist everywhere across the defense and the offense, and they're going to create a bunch of marginal advantages for the Giants that are going to overstate the level of talent that they have relative to the Vikings. But I still think that the Vikings are just a more talented team, and in areas where they've got more talent, that talent is going to show up overwhelmingly in favor of the Vikings. And I was praising Ben McAdoo as a head coach, but I mean, like, who's the better head coach? It's probably Mike Zimmer.
I think that is a fair assessment.
Yeah, I'm worried about Sam Bradford because the first half of that Carolina Panthers game is really worrisome, and it speaks to. I mean, he's been an inconsistent player throughout his career. He's had a bunch of 100 passer rating games, and he's had a bunch of 70 passer rating games and stuff like that. I'm not saying he's due or anything like that. I'm not saying this is the defense that'll make him freak out or something like that. But after that incredible game against Green Bay and that really lackluster start against Carolina, I'm worried about an up and down performance, and I'm wondering sort of how much that's going to impact things. I think that if he doesn't turn over the ball again, I think that he's going to create opportunities to score, and that'll probably be enough that you're not necessarily going to have to rely on like defensive turnovers and return touchdowns in order to win.
Well, it just seems like too good to be true that Sam Bradford is this like amazing, consistent, like untapped talent who has, outstanding game management and ball management skills. That there does feel, and maybe this is just curmudgeonly Vikings fan, but there does feel like at some point there will be an element of coming back to earth for Bradford, and hopefully it's not because he's being like violently put on the earth by like a defensive lineman or a defensive back.
Yeah, I mean the worst come back to earth scenario is that Sam Bradford gets re-injured, but yeah, but I think the likelihood that Sam Bradford is an average player, which I think, I mean, if he's an average quarterback, I think that's what Vikings fans were hoping for when they said that they would trade a first-round pick for Sam Bradford. So the people who wanted the trade didn't anticipate that he would be a 100 passer rating level player or a top 5 player or anything like that. They anticipated someone who'd be an average passer who was held back in previous stints by the supporting cast and his offensive coordinator. And so him being an average passer would be sort of a comeback to earth, which it's not a problem.
It's fine.
Yeah. But yeah, it's going to it's going to be sobering if he performs like an average quarterback, even though that's kind of what people wanted. So I'm probably going to find myself in a situation where I am still against the trade, but I want to reassure people who were for the trade that this is what you traded for, and this is what you wanted, and you just were set up unfairly by the expectations of the Green Bay game, and now he's performing like an average passer, which to me is not worth it, but you already said to you that was worth it, so you should be happy. Like, I don't want to be in that position, but I wouldn't be surprised if I ended up being in that position. And I don't want to like be a Debbie Downer, which I'm constantly am on Twitter and on this podcast about a undefeated, incredibly talented team. But I think that you're right. I think that if we examine our priors, if we just take a look at what we know about Sam Bradford, we've had 3 good quarters of play from Sam Bradford and 1 quarter of bad play from Sam Bradford. And that even in a new environment, even when we understand that these things are a completely different set of factors and variables that influence his playmaking ability and the statistics he puts up and the decisions he can make and the comfort that he feels, even with that understanding that these 4 quarters are more representative of the player that we have than the last season was, I think that the overwhelming amount of data that we have from the last season probably indicate that he's probably an average passer. And I think that you're right, that we can't reasonably expect, and to be unfair to him, honestly, that we can't reasonably expect him to perform at this level for the rest of the season. I don't know if that come back down to earth game is against the Giants. Their secondary is just not that great. Their linebackers are not that great. You can run drag routes all day on that linebacking core. And if Sam Bradford's good at anything, it's hitting Stephon Diggs in stride. But it's going to happen somewhere.
Well, how much of it do you think is contingent on Kyle Rudolph? I mean, this seems like real love between Bradford and Rudolph. And you get the sense that Bradford really enjoys having like a really big dude with a measure of athleticism to throw to, who is not Stephon Diggs, who is like his other like BFF. But I guess, do you think that? First of all, are you on the Kyle Rudolph hype train yet? And if so, why? If not, why not?
I'm not on the hype train, but I'm not on the Debbie Downer train either, which I was before the season. I don't want to be like tricked by Kyle Rudolph again. I'm just like protecting myself.
If Kyle Rudolph invites you out to dinner, you go. You let him buy you dinner. You have a nice meal, but you don't listen to any of his nonsense about how he wants to get back together. He hasn't changed. You just go and you have a nice meal and you let him pay, and then you go back home and do whatever you were going to do. You don't. I'm with you on that. But
I do want to say he had a spectacular game in every respect, and as a receiver, as a blocker, etc. He was a bit of a roller coaster, but for the most part, it was a fun ride last week. I'm worried that there's going to be more drops in the near future. I'm worried that there's going to be more blocking failures in the near future, especially as a run blocker. But he's been playing extremely well so far, and he should get credit for that. But I don't know if he's earned up enough credit. Maybe that's the way to put it. Earned up enough credit for you to bank on. See, it's another look at all the money analogies we're making. Bank on similar future performances from Rudolph. I think that what we know about Stephon Diggs, you could say, hey, yes, Diggs is turning into an elite player. You can bank on that. What we know about Adam Thielen, yeah, he's turning into a pretty solid possession receiver based on what we know in his progression throughout camp and stuff like that. You could probably bank on that. Jerick McKinnon has been more inconsistent than I want to say because I'm a huge McKinnon fan. But based off of the priors that we have, he's been playing pretty well. And maybe it's a more reliable thing to bank on. Not that you can bank on it, but like in terms of risk analysis, it's probably not as bad. So yeah, that's where I am on Kyle Rudolph. I'm certainly not on the no, he actually sucks. Watch out. But I'm definitely not on the he's elite now. I think that he's probably above average, and that's the information that we have available to us, but be careful.
You may or may not be able to take that to the bank. No,
exactly.
I secretly imagine that you are like waiting on your front porch with your cane so that when Bradford throws 2 picks to Kyle Rudolph and one of them gets returned for a touchdown, you'll be there to wave your cane and be like, this is what you wanted. You got he is who we thought he was.
So in Twitter history.
This is exactly what we got. I warned you. And that's what I expect.
Arif, aren't you sad? I'm sad but satisfied.
I've never been happy. I like the phrase "sadified" to like as a portmanteau of sad and satisfied. That's this game will leave you satisfied.
Because you can't say sad-isfied. You have to get rid of that second S, and then that way you know it's a portmanteau and not you're just not pronouncing the T in satisfied.
Yeah,
satified.
Oh, okay, satified. Yeah. Well, no, because that makes it sound like you were just like made sad. Like I was happy, and then and then Bradford's poor performance satified me.
But like it's so common to drop the T into a D sound in English that it's like very difficult to create that unless it's in text, right? Like you can't be like, yeah, this is satisfaction. People would just like, yeah, that's how you pronounce the T.
That's
satisfied.
True. This is why we need a video feed so that we can, have the words on the screen.
Spell it out in the video.
Exactly, so that people don't have to worry about our elocution. Although, in my never-ending quest to become a increasingly twee douchebag, I try very hard to, keep my T's plosive. Keep the D where it belongs at the front of my name.
You're all about keeping the D where it belongs, huh?
Well, it's gotten the Vikings to where they are today. It's a quality that I believe is worth emulating.
Good point. I was definitely talking about the defense.
Yes. Yes, you were. Any final I guess thoughts, any like score prediction, kind of 2-sentence takeaway for this game before we answer a couple of mailbag questions and get out of here?
No score prediction, but the spread is Vikings -4, right? I think it is. If it is, I'm going to take the Vikings.
Looking at Vegas Insider, it is everywhere from 3.5 to 5, including 4 and 4.5, depending on the books.
Well, let's take a look at what I'm going to take a look at the Super Contest real quick and use that as my official whatever. Okay, so I'm taking a look at the Super Contest, and the Vikings Giants Monday night is 4.5. So I'm going to take the Vikings 4.5 over the Giants.
Well, you said you've been doing pretty well against the spread, or excuse me, with the over under. What if it looks like 43 or 43.5 is the consensus over under?
Oh, that one's tough, actually. Because, I mean, you have to take into account that the Vikings offense has been underperforming. The way that they've been scoring points is relatively unsustainable. But the Giants are sort of in the opposite end, where the fact that they haven't scored many points is not sustainable relative to the performances they put forward. We'll take the over. Yeah,
I kind of like the over. I see this game as, kind of characteristic this season in that New York hits the ground, running, scores maybe a touchdown or two, and then Vikings Twitter becomes deeply depressed at halftime before like a pick six or like a fumble return for a touchdown. Both happen in the second half, and we go on to win, like 28-21 or something, 28-24.
All right. So is 28-24 your score prediction?
Yes.
All right.
It is
Lock
done.
it in.
Book it, or don't. Specifically, don't. If booking it would be an illegal act in your jurisdiction. Mailbag this week.
Glad we got that resolved.
Yeah, well, that was close. Mailbag this week is kind of soft. I mean,
Is it morally weak?
It lacks energy. Does not have the stamina.
Low motor.
Sad.
Sad.
Just sad. No. We covered most of the... Well, I mean, it was just a bunch of just like stuff we were going to talk about on the podcast anyway, and questions that you probably answered 1,000 times on Twitter. Although there was a fun one from Alex Goebel at Uleron on Twitter. Which is worse, a hangnail that you ripped off and took too much skin with it, or Andre Smith?
Oh. Oh, God. Oh, God. How do I pick?
It's got to be Andre Smith, because if you do that thing with a hangnail and you end up with that little like extra tail of skin, you can just go in there with like a pair of scissors or a nail clipper and like cut it down, and then it won't bother you as much. But we cannot simply rid ourselves of his contract. I mean, it hurts for like a little while, but it doesn't hurt for an entire season. We have at least one season of Andre Smith. Yeah, I have to go with Andre Smith
because of the season thing.
It's a different kind of pain, but it just lasts so much longer. Not that a hangnail is good. It just the experience is over relatively quickly. A couple of email questions from Matt in Wisconsin, as he has I guess named himself. The Viking season last year and so far this year is one long injury narrative. What's up with that? Is it the same with other teams? Have injury rates increased, or has the high demand for content made us more aware of the frequency of injury? Oh, and a follow-up to that. How much of a perverse incentive do players have to hide or paper over injuries until the season begins? In terms of like salary impact, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, well, for the second thing, there's been a myriad of articles written about this. They have an enormous incentive to hide injuries until the season begins. Yeah. Player incentives and team incentives actually do not line up all that often. Individual player incentives, they run contra to a bunch of team goals and stuff like that.
Richard Sherman has some thoughts on
this
that.
is definitely one of those instances. As for the first question about the Vikings seeming to catch the injury bug more than you would have expected, I don't think it's a case of like us paying attention to it more, or the national media. I think that the Vikings are just getting injured more often at more important positions.
So does it seem like that's happening like around the league this year? I mean, It's
it seems like it. I think the thing is, though, it's happening to premier fantasy football players. I think it's probably happening at a higher rate than normal, but I think that the rate that it's happening at is being overstated.
So all the first and second round picks are now sitting on the sidelines, or on day to day.
Yeah, exactly. And so ex linebacker who normally would get injured, like Sean Lee. Sean Lee's healthy, right? If we have an injury bug going around, what is Sean Lee doing out there? But tell me that, great.
He's the canary in the coal mine for injuries. If Sean Lee's still out there, then it's probably all right. But on the flip side, J.J. Watt played 86 games in a row. And now he's probably done for the season, and possibly next season too. And actually, now that we found it's a back injury, he'll probably never be the same.
Well, okay, so the J.J. Watt thing I would not attribute to this season. He was just dumb and didn't do anything about it until this season. It was an injury that he had sustained at the end of last season. So
he was just being tough. And okay,
yeah, I mean, he came back from a slipped disc or herniated disc, not slipped. Herniated disc in 6 weeks, and Jeff Schwartz tweeted out, "Well, I suppose I should have expected that. I cannot imagine coming back from a herniated disc in 6 weeks. When I was recovering from a herniated disc surgery, I couldn't move after 6 weeks. So he probably attacked his rehab with too much grit. That's probably what happened to JJ.
Too gritty."
Yeah, but yeah, there's not as many defensive injuries as there are offensive injuries, and I think that's coloring our perception of the total amount of injuries. Not to say oh my god, all these quarterbacks went down this year. That's a problem, because it is. But yeah, although I guess quarterbacks going down has been pretty stellar. You got your Dak Prescotts and your Sam Bradfords and your Carson Wentz's
and your Brian Hoyers.
Yeah, he's playing better than Jay, right?
Well, that's
your Trevon Boykins.
Apparently, Jay has to win his job back now when he comes back from his thumb injury.
That's astounding.
The Bears are they sure are something this year.
That's a good way to put it. They are definitely something.
They are a unique thing, a precious flower. But yeah, well, and I mean, it certainly seems to me that the marquee player injury thing is real. And maybe you're right. Maybe it is just a function of me having both Adrian Peterson and Keenan Allen on my fantasy team.
Well, it's a function of everybody having these players on their fantasy teams. But yeah, I think, you've got Adrian Peterson and Keenan Allen, and not Todd. Todd is just being bad. Todd Gurley is just bad. He's not injured. But yeah, I mean, it's just been. All these quarterbacks are gone. All these receivers are getting hurt. We don't hear about all those defensive backs getting hurt because they're not really getting hurt, except for Rhodes, but only for a couple weeks.
Well, because they don't have to try as hard. They're playing against backups.
See, it balances itself out naturally. It's got its own ecology.
It's a self-sustaining ecosystem of player injuries. Matt in Wisconsin. There is an approximately uniform level of injury, and it's just a matter of the league finding homeostasis within itself. There's your answer, and we've got all the science to back it up. You'll just have to go to our website, read all about it. Arif will write 15,000 words about it at some point this season. The homeostatic injury theory. Which actually would be a great name for a Rush cover band. That.
Yeah, I'll give you that. That makes sense.
So I think that's about. Let me see if somebody came through on Twitter. Nope.
These are all trash.
Nope. Yeah, that's a soft effort, guys. We need more hustle. I know 2 shows a week is a big commitment. We struggle with making them sometimes, but if you guys can show up with a strong mailbag week in and week out, then it will lead to higher quality digital multimedia content. So thank you in advance for better mailbags.
Yeah.
any parting shots, last words, stuff you want to plug? I know you've been tapping away, writing this or that thing.
Haven't been able to put out the offensive line piece or the player feature piece or the how to stop this player piece, which sucks because I intend to do those sorts of things this week. I'll probably get one of those 3 out. The reason I haven't been able to get those other things out is that I'm working on a project which I cannot reveal yet, but is very exciting.
Ooh. I
so
actually can't tell you if it's exciting or not. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, you'll know what it is when it drops, but yeah, look for that.
Excellent. So please stand by with bated breath because things are happening in Arif's world, and you will not want to miss them, as per usual. Beyond that, you can enjoy the entire Norse Code archive on dailynorseman.com, along with articles and podcasts by many fine members of the Minnesota Vikings fan community. You can go to our website, norsecodepodcast.com, and check out, show pages, links. There's a link to our YouTube channel, Facebook page, Twitter page. Facebook page is facebook.com/dailynorseman. In case you've never been there, pop on over and give us a quick like. And we always, when we post an episode, of course, it goes out to all the different podcast aggregators, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever fine podcasts are aggregated, and YouTube as well. But then when I post to the website, it automatically gets cross-posted to Facebook and also Twitter. So if you like us on Facebook, then you will always be up to date with the new episodes. You can like us on Twitter, or follow us on Twitter, I guess. You like posts, you follow people. At NorseCodeDN, an account managed by our intrepid producer, James, who will have a few small, difficult edits this week. So another virtual hat tip to him for all his hard work. Arif, of course, is at Arif Hassan NFL, and I am at Dusty O'Connell on Twitter. If you want to email a question to the show, then you can do so, norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. We do accept questions throughout the week, but actually only if they're good. So save your bad questions for the day before the show so that I can look at them and be disappointed. Let's see. I think that's about it. Plug-wise. Yeah. Cool. PayPal.me/NorseCode if you want to throw a few bucks our way. If you would like to do so on a recurring basis, Patreon.com/NorseCode is the place to go do that. And of course, there are links to all that stuff on our show pages and on our website. So please consider making a small contribution to keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay so that we can continue bringing you the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. James will be back early next week, or actually maybe I will. I don't know. Someone will be here. Arif will be here for sure, and someone else will be here with him to recap the Vikings win over the Giants and talk about what it means to go 4-0 for the first time since 2009, 2012?
I don't know, maybe. Probably not 2009.
Whatever the season was where we went 6-0 to start. That was the last time.
Wasn't that a bad season?
It started well. Well, and I think this year we can say that we've been beating better competition early in the season.
Yeah,
significantly better competition. So we've got that going for us. At any rate, that stuff will all happen after Monday, probably actually directly after the game. So tune in then. And are we still doing Spoons Out? Is that?
Yeah, no, we're still Spoons Out.
Cool. Well, until then, Spoons Out.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.